So yeah, as Trish said, I'll be talking a bit about sort of PGR identities, power and supervision, and potential impacts on the mental health and well-being of PGRs. So we all know how important the supervisory relationship is to PGR success. I feel like I don't need to gospel at this group about that. But we also know that there's a lot of variability in PGR experiences, supervisor training, and the approach that supervisors take to supervision. So just as a little bit of background on my PhD as a whole, so I started with a systematic review looking at students disclosing mental health challenges, either formally by presenting to student services or disability support, or informally, just talking to, say, a lecturer or their supervisor. I then did a quantitative investigation where I unpicked PGR experiences from a wider student cohort, which then led to what I'm going to be talking about today, which is qualitative interviews with PGRs on their experience of their PhD journey, mental health, talking to their supervisor, and what they feel that universities should be doing to better support their mental health. So I did 20 interviews with PGRs from all across the UK, and I will come back and do a little bit of reflection on the interviewing process towards the end of this presentation. My sample was self-selecting PGRs, so I put out a call for participants, and all of the data was analysed using thematic analysis. There are a number of themes that came out of my study, such as processes, so like the formal processes that PGRs have to go through in terms of annual reviews or progression boards, the Viva, and also the provisions in terms of training and personal and professional development opportunities, the environment that they were doing their PhD in, both in terms of physical space, so if they were hot desking or had allocated desks, whether they were based in a lab or not, but also sort of the cultural environment, so what they thought about research culture, whether they felt sort of as an equal to colleagues, and then wider university support structures and accessibility. But what I'll be talking about today is the ideas of identity, power, and privilege. So we often think of PGRs as just PGRs, you know, they're a student, they're doing a PhD. Actually, there are so many identities that PGRs are balancing. Yes, they're a student doing a PhD, but they're also existing within a wider system of academia. They're aware of the implications of sector-wide decisions, sector-wide cultures. They're also balancing the experience of being a supervisee, working in that close relationship with a supervisor, knowing perhaps when they should push back and stand their ground, or when they need to do what their supervisor says. They're also balancing their identity as an up-and-coming sort of blossoming researcher, thinking about what do they want to do with their career, becoming an independent researcher. And they're also balancing all of the aspects of their individual identity, because we are all multifaceted individuals. So when we think about PGRs, we can often think that they just have the identity of PGR, and actually there's a lot more than that going on behind the scenes. So the PGRs I spoke to felt that their identity as a PGR was often really tied for their motivations to study. Some were motivated by an interest in science, an interest in research. Others were motivated by wanting a better life for themselves and their families. Others were motivated by more external pressures, feeling like they needed a PhD to progress. But it was felt that with the identity of a PhD student came a number of assumptions from the institution and from their supervisors. As we can see by the quote, there's an assumption that when you start a PhD, you know how to finish a PhD. And that's not really the case for the majority of PGRs who haven't done one before. There are assumptions from supervisors that PGRs know about how to publish, peer review, how to find journals, that they know how to navigate the supervisor relationship, that they know how to do all of these things, that actually a number of my PGRs felt really made their identity as a PGR feel unstable. And there was also a perception from my sample that being a PGR was supposed to be all that they were, that everything else should come before the PhD. and that actually taking time away from the PhD or struggling with it meant that they were a bad PhD student. There was an idea of what a PhD student is, and, oh, excuse me, I'm not sure what's gone on there. I'm in an office, so no idea what happened there. So it was felt that their identity as an individual tended to clash with the idea of what a PhD student was. So PGRs who had caring responsibilities were perhaps the first in their family to go to university, were LGBTQ+, had different life goals, had come from the working world, had experience of mental health challenges. These were all seen to be incompatible with being a PhD student and aspects of their identity that they needed to hide. As we can see by the quote on the screen, this PGR didn't want to ask questions. They didn't want to seem stupid, when actually, it should be that we're encouraging PGRs to ask questions, regardless of background or whether they feel their questions are stupid or not. A lot of the sample felt that their individual aspects of their identity had to be hidden or put to one side for fear of discrimination or harassment, or not feeling like a true PhD student. The identity issue was even more complex for international students. They felt their identity as a PGR was often uncertain, with visa issues being a major thing, and them often feeling like they have, at any moment, the rug could be pulled out from under them and their identity as a PGR could be taken away. There's also the issue of sort of being in an unfamiliar country, often with people that you don't know, being away from family and friends, and that sense of familiarity. And also some of the complications that can come from navigating the PGR process as an international student. So perhaps supervision is very different to how supervision worked at your master's in your home country, or also things like accessing support through university or NHS services requiring all documents to be in English when actually your documents are in another country or aren't written in English. For PGRs who taught, their identity was always in flux. They weren't really sure whether they were a student or a staff member, whether that could change depending on the time of day or the day of the week it was, and how they felt that often they went from being an equal to colleagues in their department to being below them in the academic hierarchy without anything about themselves changing. It was just whether they were teaching at that moment or not. So all of these identities were being balanced against power structures both within academia and within institutions. Participants were very aware of the issues of classism, racism, sexism, homophobia within academia as a whole, and also identified them within their own institutions. We can see here from the quote on the screen that this PGR identifies themselves as coming from a lesser position of power because they're a PGR, because they're an international student, and because they're a woman. And it led to a number of my PGRs not reporting direct experiences of harassment because they felt that the power that they had within their institution was very limited. There was also one PGR who reported harassment to their supervisor, but because of their supervisor's position within the institution, felt that nothing happened because their supervisor was also lower down the hierarchy, being a minoritized woman. There was a lot of talk of luck and inequity among my participants. So PGRs felt lucky to have supervisors that would read their work, that would meet with them, felt lucky to have supervisors who would ask how they were doing as a person rather than just as a researcher. And it was felt that there was real inequities in terms of the type of supervision and the resources that supervisors were given between departments within institutions, but also between students. I think it is important for me to note here as well that my participants were very, very giving in terms of what they spoke about and the time that they gave me, but also that alongside all the issues of identity and power, these were just some of the things that were disclosed to me during interviews. So not only are PGRs balancing their study all of their individual identity factors, they may also be dealing with all of these external stresses. So hopefully you can see quite clearly how identity management might impact on PGR mental health. You know, if they're feeling particularly unsure about who they are as a researcher, as a PGR, where they sit within their institution, where they sit within the academy, how they're balancing their supervisory relationship, that is going to cause anxiety and stress. For PGRs who felt they had to hide aspects of their identity, such as their sexuality, this was more impactful on their mental health and well-being when they did experience harassment and discrimination, because they didn't feel like they were able to openly speak about it. They also felt that their identity as a PGR really impacted the resources that were available for their mental health. So supervisors were felt to focus on just a project, and the university was felt to focus on just undergraduate or taught students. So things like support being taken away during the summer, presenting to support services who offered accommodations relating to note-taking and lectures. It was felt that their identity as a PGR really affected not only their own mental health and well-being, but the resources that universities provided to manage their mental health and well-being, and often felt quite forgotten by their institutions. There was also the impact of supervision on mental health and well-being. We know that supervision has a really big impact on the mental health of the PGR, but also on the mental health of the supervisor. And that was something that came across in some of the interviews, was that PGRs were really struggling, but didn't want to tell their supervisor because they knew their supervisor was under so much pressure, and that their supervisor, you know, also had all of their external stresses going on and didn't want to, you know, negatively impact on their supervisor. It was felt that supervisors had an awful lot of power within the relationship, and that supervisors could use that power for good, i.e. advocating on their PGR's behalf, checking in with them about things more than just their research, letting them know about potential conferences, things that would help their personal and professional development, or use their power for bad in terms of belittling or engaging in discrimination or harassment behaviours with their PGR, not supporting their PGR to advocate for themselves or advocating on their behalf, and not viewing them as more than just their research, as an actual individual with many parts of their identity. Another impact on the mental health and well-being of my sample was the actual work of the PhD, particularly those who were doing quite emotionally charged topics. They found it really difficult to disengage from their work, and found that the emotional topic that they were studying really negatively affected their mental health and well-being in a way that their supervisors were not equipped to support them with, and the institution also did not offer any support. So in terms of implications for practice, one of the key things is thinking about equity of information and resources, and particularly when it comes to student services and any support resources that are being put in place, is that co-creation to make sure that PGRs aren't being treated like taught students, and that their identity as a PGR is taken into account. Also considering for PGRs who teach, you know, making a real delineation between support as a staff member and support as a student, acknowledging that they can often fall into that grey area. It's really important for doctoral colleges to allow supervisors the time and the space to reflect on their own practice, to reflect on the power that they have and how they might be perceived by their PGR, and for them to be given the time and space to acknowledge the identities that their PGR might be juggling and how that might affect their experience of being supervised and doing the PhD. And also universities need to be really considering the support that they give supervisors in terms of looking after their own mental health, but also for supervising PGRs who are looking at more emotionally difficult topics, and the support opportunities that they're giving PGRs before, during, and while they are, and after they are embarking on these potentially emotionally difficult topics. So some reflections from me on this process, because I feel it would be wrong of me not to. I am a PGR with my own lived experience of mental health challenges, and this was emotionally difficult work. I was not prepared for the need for PGRs to tell their stories. So my recruitment experience was quite difficult. I had people that I had to signpost to crisis support, people who didn't want to take part in my study, but just needed to tell their story to someone, anyone who was listening. And there is a real need for spaces for PGRs to share what's going on with them and how they found the journey to other PGRs. There were a couple of things that I did in order to stay well. So I was very fortunate in that I have a 3-person supervisory team, one of whom was allocated the time to have weekly debriefs with me. I also kept a research journal to get all of my feelings about the interviews out, and thought really carefully about when I would schedule interviews. So I tended to do them in the afternoon so that afterwards I could switch off for the day, maybe have a cry, lie on the sofa, watch bad TV, whatever it was that I felt was going to help me. I think when we're approaching topics like mental health or potentially emotionally challenging topics, we have this view that doing the research, as in doing the interview itself, might be difficult. I wasn't prepared for the emotional impact rippling through transcription into coding all the way through analysis. So I think it's really important for PGRs and supervisors and just anyone doing research in this area to be aware of that ripple effect and to really plan and err on the side of caution in terms of putting in support all the way through that process. So I want to thank you for listening, and also to the PGRs who shared their experiences with me so openly. I am currently still recruiting for a study looking at this from the supervisor perspective, how they view the relationship, the support that they need as supervisors, training needs, barriers to effective supervision, everything like that. So do feel free to get in touch with me by email or on Twitter, or just scan the QR code on the screen now. But that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That was a really fascinating presentation. I think there's so many angles that you came at that from, and it was wonderful to get a glimpse into the project. And I'm sure whoever your examiners are going to have hopefully a lovely piece of work to be able to read, I'm sure, and take you through the journey you've been on. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so it'd be great now at this point if there are any questions that people may have. As regards Amy's work, her projects, and her reflections on doing that work. So if you do have any questions, please feel free either to use the chat or to raise your hand and unmute yourself and to speak to Amy. So I'm going to start off with a question because I'm sure people are typing at the moment, Amy. I guess in terms of, I'm curious to know about your expectations before you started data collection and now your reflections having come through the process, and how they match, don't match. Yeah, curious just to throw that out there and see what your response is.
Yeah, so I didn't go into this naive. I knew that it could be a difficult experience, and I intentionally kept my questions very broad, and I was expecting, being a stranger on a computer screen, that, you know, people may not share too much with me. I had a number of interviews that lasted for over 2 hours, and people telling me things that they straight up said, I've never told anybody this before, but and it felt a lot of responsibility to be given that information, to be the person that people were sharing these things with. It was quite draining, more so than I thought it would, and I wasn't expecting to, I guess, worry about the participants afterwards. You know, when you're transcribing an interview where someone's been quite distressed, you can't, I hope they're doing okay. Obviously, I can't reach out to them to check because that's not within the remit of a researcher. You know, I'd equipped myself as best as possible, being a mental health first aider, doing IAP, all of those things. I also didn't expect it to be as emotionally affecting to me. I never thought I would cry with a participant, particularly with it being online. But I hope that me being open with them allowed them to feel like it was a safe space for them to share. But I definitely learned a lot about myself as a researcher during this process. And yeah, I think my supervisory team learned a lot as well, because we had put things in place like debriefs and, you know, what are we going to do if a participant's in crisis, things like that. But it still, I think, affected me more than we were all expecting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'm sure it's something, you know, that a lot of us will take away today, is that, yeah, some of the challenges that we experience in our qualitative work. Okay, so there's a few questions in the chat, and I know there's some hands raised as well. So Natalie, her question was around kind of that wellbeing support is often focused on undergraduate students, and wondered if any of their participants had ideas on what support for PhD researchers could potentially look like.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It wasn't something that came out of the interviews as much. It more so came out of the quantitative work. But things like, they were particularly focused on like vivas and training sessions, but things like having breaks built in, having access to rooms with curtains so that students could adjust the light, and flexibility around deadlines for students who were lab-based, you know, making sure that they were accessible for those with physical mobility needs, and also the understanding of the main thing was just for supervisors to understand that life happens outside the PhD, and that the PhD can't be your whole life. Another idea of support that my participants were in the interviews were quite, they wondered why it hadn't been rolled out to PGRs, was sort of peer mentoring that they saw for undergraduates and that they saw for sort of academic members of staff, and things like mentoring schemes as well.
Okay, yeah, hopefully some useful suggestions there, Natalie, for you. So Hayley has said that she runs a group mentoring PGR monthly session open to all PGRs across the university, and there's a theme that they have every month. Looking at your research, would you have any recommendations on a theme?
I think a big one would be taking care of themselves as a researcher. So one of the questions that I asked participants was how they keep themselves well, and that was by far the shortest answers that I got across all of the questions. They really struggled to take care of themselves, and also felt like the idea of what a PhD student was someone who worked super long hours. There was this idea of almost competitiveness over, you know, who got the least sleep, who's taken on the most things, and there wasn't really a sense of community a lot. It was more of a competitive research culture. Also, imposter syndrome, I think, is a really big thing, particularly for students who are first generation, who don't have any experience of their family going to university. And also how to respond to criticism, I think can be a real learning curve when you've gone through an education system where everything is sort of numerical marks based, and then you come to the PhD and it can all feel a bit vague, and actually how to take that criticism and improve your work, particularly if supervisors themselves are quite vague about saying, you know, this needs rewriting, but not actually about, you know, how to do that. Again, I think there's that assumed knowledge that can come through and
Okay, yes, there's some really valuable points there, and I think it's often just having those discussions, isn't it, around some of these topics, and that can draw out more stories, and people can it starts to resonate with experience. So, a question from Paul: did you encounter any students who were getting different kinds of supervision models? And the example was around kind of peer mentoring too.
No, all of the students all described their supervision experiences, while the amount of contact they had with their supervisors varied from seeing them once every 3 months to sort of weekly. They all described it as a very, I will go tell them what I've done, give them work, receive feedback, meeting is done, repeat when we next meet sort of model. They weren't really familiar with any other type of supervision, and they weren't really sure if that's what supervision was supposed to be. And particularly for PGRs who felt a big power difference with their supervisors, they weren't sure where boundaries lied in terms of telling their supervisor about things that were going on outside the PhD for them, or disclosing things that might be relevant to how they were doing in their studies. So talking about their well-being for fear that their supervisor, you know, wouldn't hire them afterwards or would write a bad reference, or, you know, they felt that the supervisors had such power because I think of some of the models that we used, even though the participants maybe weren't aware that those were models being used.
Okay, yeah, I think that's, yeah, nice question. I have another question coming off the back of that, but I'll go first to Julie, who's patiently had hand raised for quite a while.
Thanks, Trish, and hi, Amy. Good to see you. Amy, this is really important research, and I've just realised I'm sitting in the dark. There we go, putting this light on. It's really important and it's really interesting. And excuse me, sorry, I was fine until I switched my mic on. You know, I work really hard, I think, with my students to try and ensure that there's appropriate support, that they can talk about, you know, their kind of life happening beyond the PhD, and that I can support them through those things. But even from that perspective, as a supervisor, I am very aware of the power imbalance. You know, I acknowledge that I have the power and I have the privilege in that relationship. I'm aware that it's difficult for my students to talk to me about certain things, and actually sometimes it's not appropriate for those conversations because, you know, that there has to be a professional boundary. And actually not having that professional boundary gets as messy as having too much of one. And I wonder, I'm sort of trying to work out, and it sort of ties in with the questions here about peer mentoring, but I'm not sure peer mentoring is the right answer either. I'm wondering whether we need to have somebody who isn't the supervisor, who isn't a staff member in the same department, because they're always, you know, potentially going to go and talk to the supervisor, right? And there's always, you know, there's the risk of people. I'm just thinking about, you know, my own supervision, people kind of, you know, forming a kind of club to support the supervisor if there's a problem and things like that, and that's not good either. So I'm wondering if there's room for a person who has a specific role around providing that pastoral support, academic support, advice about what supervision should look like when it's gone wrong, to be able to say, yeah, that's not a functional supervision relationship. But I don't know who that person could be, because it feels like peer mentoring, often the peer won't know either, because they only know about their own supervision relationship. But staff introduces this extra imbalance again. So is there a model that we're missing across the sector? What can we do?
I mean, there are institutions who have kind of introduced a triad model of supervision with one member of staff who, again, isn't based in the department, who is purely there for a pastoral, more like a personal tutor, undergrad sort of role, which does seem to be relatively new in the sector and is much more common in a lot of the professional doctorates. So I think they're learning from the professional doctorates that actually having a multidisciplinary team approach almost to supervision can be really beneficial to the student. I think as well, just allowing students the space to have these discussions is really important, because one of the things that my students said was it wasn't about wanting their supervisors to solve their problems or anything like that. It was just particularly for those who had the most experience during the pandemic, their supervisor was the only person they were seeing. So actually, you know, just being able to talk with someone, it just so happened that for some of them that was their supervisor because of their circumstances. And also the supervisor was seen as sort of like a gatekeeper to knowledge. I mean, one of the things that came out of my survey was that very, I think under 10% of PGRs were given any information on mental health support before they had their induction, and that didn't rise to more than half after their induction. So it might be that there are things like, you know, probably not more structured peer assisted learning mentoring, but just, you know, mentoring or social connectedness that exists that PGRs just aren't being told about.
Thanks, Amy. That's really helpful. I like the idea of a personal tutor, but maybe from a different department. Sounds possibly good. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. That's great. I'm just making my way through the chat. Yeah, I think Alex, hopefully I summarize your point correctly here, but you've kind of highlighted that actually there can be lots of people performing different roles, and there might be some kind of patchy or inconsistencies in terms of the support being provided. Amy, I guess for you, for supervisors, what do you think coming through in your work is needed to be able to better support supervisors in their role?
Yeah, just to pick up on the point that Alex made, I believe it was either 2020 or 2021. I've lost all track of time over my PhD. There was a report from, I think it was Technicians UK, about the amount of sort of technicians, like lab technicians, IT, things like that, that were receiving disclosures around mental health from students and actually advocating for them to get some training so they knew, you know, where to signpost, what to do, and can often be the same with postdocs. They often feel sort of, I guess, one rung closer to the PGR than like an academic. I think one of the big things for institutions is just time. Supervisors being, you know, adequately workloaded for supervision. One of the things that's coming out of the interviews that I've been doing with supervisors, you know, some institutions giving their supervisors 1 hour a month for PGR supervision, which is just, you know, of course it's going to turn into that almost robotic relationship and not allow supervisors the time to care about their PGR as more than just their research and as a human being, if they are themselves sort of overworked, overloaded. I think as well, understanding that there is a pastoral element to supervision. As much as some supervisors might like to think there isn't. You are spending 3 years with someone. I think one thing that we've all learned over the past couple of years with COVID is that, you know, things can happen very unexpectedly. And so there will always be a pastoral element to supervision. I think providing training that isn't just about regulations, but actually uses things like case studies or role play to identify examples of good practice or bad practice can be really helpful. I know that Queen Mary developed, with some Catalyst funding, they developed sort of role play scenarios in tandem with the wellbeing service. So they had that sort of trained clinical perspective on how to deal with a student who perhaps was in crisis. But I think, as well as time and resources, I think supervisors need support themselves as well. One of the things that's come out of the interviews I've done with supervisors so far is that they often have a lot of the same feelings as PGRs in terms of imposter syndrome and feeling like their identity's in flux and they don't know if they're, you know, being a good supervisor or doing it well. So allowing them that time and space as well is a big thing. Whether that will happen, I'm not overly optimistic because of the financial pressures on the sector. But I think the main thing is time and resources and support.
Yeah, I think they're really important points, and thank you, Amy, for sharing that. Great. I just want to see. Oh, Joe, you have a hand up.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I just kind of wanted to ask, if it was okay, is I think you've spoken wonderfully, Amy, about some of the things that you did to manage your own well-being and kind of some of the wider resources and training that you've done to kind of generate an awareness of mentally healthy practice. And as I say, the steps you took within your research, are those things that have been highlighted to you or encouraged as part of your academic journey? Is there that kind of system within your university that you've been directed towards these resources, these training opportunities, these ways of working, or, as I did anticipate you might say, are these things that you found for yourself?
Sorry, I'm not sure why I was muted then. I'm in the middle of trying to pull together a sort of autoethnography about the experience, because one of the things I found really disorienting is, you know, I did an undergrad in psychology, I did a master's in clinical psychology research, I've done 4 or 5 training modules at my PhD on qualitative work. So I knew how to do an interview, how to code, how to analyze, how to transcribe. I had no idea what to do when you've got a participant crying in front of you, no idea what to do when someone's telling you things that are potentially triggering to yourself. None of this was covered in any of the teaching, and that's not to downplay how, you know, good my teaching experience was. You know, I was taught very well by people who knew research very well, but I feel like this is a really under-acknowledged aspect of doing research, particularly for those who are, you know, early career or a PGR. You know, often at undergrad, you are discouraged from doing potentially difficult research topics because there's not the capacity to support. At least that was the experience I had at my institution. And so there's almost this assumption again that by the time you get to PhD study, you know how to deal with all the emotional side of it. And I don't think that we do. None of my training on qualitative methods mentioned any of this, any of it at all. It was all something that I had to find out myself, and it was actually quite emotional in a couple of interviews when at the end my participants were like, so how are you doing? And I was like, well, that's my job. I'm supposed to be asking questions. And they were like, well, it can't be easy for you to hear all of this stuff. Are you aware of this? And I was signposted to a Scottish based, I think it's called like emotionally challenging research in Scotland, and I was like, I wish there was an English equivalent. And it was interesting that actually my participants checked in on me far more than my institution, aside from my supervisors, despite the fact that I had to, go through the ethics process, and it was quite aware what I was studying. None of my personal experiences of teaching or training covered any of that emotional side of things.